McGrath. We're going to have a little discussion about the crossovers between Boyd of OODA Loop fame, Colonel John Boyd of the US Air Force, and some explorations that Mark's been doing on the crossovers between Boyd's ideas and Austrian economics. Mark sent me a preview of a paper that he's written with Hunter Hastings, and it's really, really interesting stuff. So we're just going to do a really high-level skim over it, and we'll probably do 2 or 3 of these to dig into a little bit of the kind of deeper detail. So Mark, why don't you just say hi and tell us how you came to this, tell us a bit about your background, and then we'll dig straight in.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I was on a podcast with Hunter last year, and he runs a website through the Mises Institute called Economics for Business, which I highly recommend everybody to go to. It's got tremendous resources. And when they had a call for content, I always saw a connection between what I learned and knew about John Boyd early on, and then through my graduate training, I have a master's in economics. I really got into the Austrian school, and I almost immediately started to see the connections between the two, even right down to the personalities, of John Boyd being very missionary about his ideas and not getting credit in his own life, similar to Ludwig von Mises, doing lots of wonderful things and not getting a lot of credit in his own lifetime. Most of his fame and notoriety has come after his death. And what really drew me, where I really saw the connection, was, Austrian economics talks a lot about action. Human action was the title of Ludwig von Mises's most famous economic work, that anything evolves or comes from humans making decisions and actions. There's also a lot of work in entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial theory, specifically around entrepreneurial judgment, entrepreneurial alertness, which is a term that some economists use that we can talk about, and really nothing to sort of bridge the gap between the two. How do you get from judgment to action? And what struck me, and what Hunter and I are working on, is that the orientation, as Boyd talks about it, and Franz Osinga has written about in his book Science, Strategy, and War, and Chuck Spinney has written about in his Evolutionary Epistemology. I saw orientation as a bridge between judgment, in that orientation shapes how you see things, and then how orientation guides and controls how you formulate decisions, how you formulate actions, and then how you learn from those things. So it seems to fit, and I think that there's still a lot of runway in this area to keep researching.
Yeah, I very much agree with you there. I'm not any kind of expert on the Austrian economic theory. I'm definitely going to read up on it, having read your paper. But the centrality of orientation is obviously something we've discussed at length, and I think is something that is often glossed over in the more kind of superficial introductions to OODA. It's just one step out of 4, whereas I think you and I both see it as, well, it's the whole deal, really, isn't it?
It's everything. Yeah. Orientation shapes how you see, how you observe. It shapes how you decide, and it shapes how you act. And I also think it directly affects how you learn and either adapt or don't adapt. And, entrepreneurship is the specific paper is around entrepreneurship and trying to bridge a gap in that theory. And not to say that one's right or wrong. I think that I think what my thesis at the moment is that Austrian economics enhances John Boyd's theories, and vice versa. John Boyd's theories enhance Austrian economics, and that was, as you saw in the paper, that's what we're discussing. Bridging a gap. I think that they complement each other very well, even though they come from completely different worlds and completely different disciplines.
So, yeah, that's really interesting to dig into, isn't it? That you've got those 2 very different starting points, but somehow there's enough commonality and similarity that you end up superficially in a very, very similar place. And that place is, how do we navigate our environment under conditions of uncertainty? And, ultimately, how do we make decisions, take actions to improve our position in the world?
Yeah. Yeah. The axiom for action, when you read Ludwig von Mises, says a person imagines what something would be like, or they have some kind of felt uneasiness and they envision what it would be like. For example, if I'm cold and I reach over here and I grab my fleece, but I had to have thought of being warm, and I have to think about what I have to do to get myself warm. That's the action axiom. But where does all that felt uneasiness, where does that occur? Well, I would say it occurs in one's orientation.
Yeah.
My orientation is processing that I'm cold. I observe where my sweater is. I make the decision to grab it. I make the act to put it on, and then it gets too hot, and I reverse it and take it off. But the judgment and the action, what connects the two? And I think that orientation seems to fit that bill at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that leapt out at me when I read that was Boyd's always talking about that capacity for independent action and the biological imperative to improve your capacity for independent action.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been musing about this a lot. I did a really great course with a friend of mine, Stephen Wilkinson, last year on kind of finance, high level finance topics. Right. And we were talking about, balance sheets and cash flows and things like that. But the whole purpose of like strategy or entrepreneurship or whatever you want to call it is you're trying to find a place in the market where you can fix or solve other people's problems and they can pay you enough, and you're trying to increase the value of that proposition. And really, when you think about it, the difference between top line and bottom line and fixing a problem in order to get to accrue wealth is really improving your capacity for independent action economically, right?
Right.
So I just wonder what that the biological imperative of survival when you're in a competitive or combat situation. I wonder how do the Austrians talk about that in their language? What does that look like in their writing?
Well, I mean, our argument obviously is very similar. I would say that if we don't make those necessary actions to make the necessary changes and adaptations, it's not only a biological imperative, it's a business imperative. If you don't continuously refine, improve, adapt, improve your position, eventually you're going to be obsolete. Eventually you're going to be irrelevant. And you have to identify exactly what you're talking about. You have to identify where those gaps are, and then how do I bridge that? And then I think that you have to have the correct internal view to continuously shatter your model and refine and adapt in order to improve, to avoid becoming obsolete or avoid getting out competed. You can't just do business as usual. You can't just do what you were taught in business school, because the real world might not match up to the paradigm that you've been given. So I think with what attracted me to Austrian theory is that there's a massive pursuit for things that are true, in my assessment. This is McGrath on Austrian economics, not Mises or Hayek or anything. But I feel like it's a pursuit of the truth that factors in, operates within the world as it really is, not as what you imagine it to be, where you can assess situations or you can assess market phenomena, and you can look at it understanding that there's behind all this, there's humans making decisions. There's humans acting. There's humans either learning fast or not learning at all. And, that's why things happen the way that they do. That's why I don't watch movies from Blockbuster Video anymore. I mean, some you have to be able to not see. I would say too, in entrepreneurship, it's not just a question of survival. I think entrepreneurs, by embracing or understanding rather Austrian economics, Austrian entrepreneurship theory, and understanding Boyd effectively, I think it actually improves your opportunity to thrive and not merely survive. And I think that when Boyd's talking about the capacity for independent and free action, the best businesses that can do what they want unimpeded are the ones that continuously adapt, continuously make the necessary refinements. They keep their mindset fresh and matched to reality.
Yeah.
They're not living in the past. They're not resting on their laurels or doing, I've heard the term, what got you here is not what's going to get you there, and you have to change and you have to shift. And I think that the theory of, a lot of the various theories that I've learned in Austrian economics, they allow for that. Like we're trying to look at the world for what it really is and make the necessary decisions and actions to improve our position.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way I think about this, having read, so the things that resonate with me most on this at the moment are things that draw from sort of Darwinian evolution as a model to explain what's going on. So the thing that resonates for me is that, what you're doing when you're part of an environment is you're trying to optimize in real time your resources and your all of the resources at your disposal in order to find that peak in a fitness landscape that keeps you in a good place, right? And can be very easy to, maybe start a business, hit something that's a niche in the market, pull away from the competition and then get complacent is probably a bit too simplistic, but
comfortable.
Comfortable is a good one. And I think what happens when you become comfortable is that you stop or you don't put enough resources into that continual testing and adjusting. And, if you got to that comfortable space in a period of relative stability, and then that stability changes because, the environment is full of other people and entities like you also trying to improve their position and capacity for independent action. So it goes in, cycles and bubbles and all the rest of it. So I think it's quite a nice mental model for pulling together the different elements of that. Boyd, I saw actually in your paper, I haven't actually read Osinga yet, which is really a terrible oversight for a supposed Boyd scholar. I'm rectifying that right now. But there's somewhere in there where you pull out a quote from Osinga where he's talking about, the DNA of a company, right? That's the orientation.
Yeah.
So I think this, there's a real thread running through all of these parts, and there's, we could also talk about constructive theory perhaps in a different call, which is something that I've become interested in lately. And it's this kind of, orientation could be this unseen or hidden structure within an organism, an organization, both of which used to be the same word, by the way, back in the 1500s, which is quite interesting. And it's, driven by that drive to find the place in the market that is has survival in it, and not survival in it. It's a place within this multi-dimensional space that you're searching for that is where you thrive, right? Some just survive, some thrive, and then the market can change and the fitness landscape you live in can change, and thriving can move to surviving quite quickly, and what used to be surviving can turn into not surviving quite quickly as well.
Right. Yeah, you used the word comfort. I think people who follow us know we're both Marines, right? You're the rural kind and I'm the US kind. But did you ever want a comfortable sentry? Right? I mean, if a sentry, I can't think of times where I was comfortable in the Marine Corps, because we're constantly keeping ourselves on edge, to be alert for anything out of the realm, because that was always the most likely course of action, is to be something that we hadn't hadn't predicted. And if we were comfortable, we were complacent. And if we were complacent, we were vulnerable to threats. Well,
there's an interesting notion about fitness there as well, isn't there? Because, you know, if you were training someone purely to be athletically fit, you certainly wouldn't train them like the military does, because part of the fitness of being in the military is also it's comfort with being uncomfortable, right? That is part of the fitness function for serving in the military, is you have to be able to withstand a certain degree of discomfort.
So when I, the last several years that I've been talking about these topics, I've really tried to demilitarize it, because I think out of that you can strip out universal principles. And a complacent sentry is an example in a military type situation, but a complacent manager or a complacent executive, it's the same thing in business. When where complacency plants a seed, a garden of the seeds of comfort are planted, the garden of complacency grows. And that's where irrelevance and obsolescence, that's where all that, I think, comes from. So the principles, actually, to me, it's the exact same, which is really, as you and I have talked over the years, that's my theory all along, is that what we were trained for a warfighting environment, you just cross out warfighting and put business, or put football, or put ice hockey. It doesn't matter.
No.
Because the principles that you're going to need to thrive are going to be similar, in many cases completely identical. So I think that's one of the powerful things about Boyd, and my understanding, or my knowledge of Austrian economics. It always seems to start from first principles that are always universally true. So everything I can deduce from that usually is fairly accurate, or obvious. So
I mean, like one of the things that I always say about Boyd's work, and having been on, I'll put a link in the notes after this is over, but having been part of a 7-hour 7-way conversation about Boyd spread over a few months with various luminaries of thinking about competition and agility.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I kept coming up for me in those conversations was, okay, OODA is one thing, right? OODA is a simplified kind of, it's had the arse kicked out of it over the years by management consultants and other people. So setting OODA aside and taking Boyd's whole body of work, the thing that absolutely fascinates and astounds me is that, here's a body of study that was taking place from sort of the late 50s to the early 90s, and it still maps incredibly well to advances in complexity and neuroscience, and then I read your paper and I discover that it also maps incredibly well to a field of Austrian economics that comes from when was Mises around?
Mises passed away, I believe, in 1972, and he was born. He lived to be 91, I believe. So I want to say 1891 or two, maybe right around there.
Wow.
I guess, 1880, maybe 1882.
So that's
he was, it's interesting about Mises and Friedrich von Hayek, for that example. And I have this in common with them, all artillery officers. So they had a much different experience than I did. They were in a great war, but I always think of artillery as being very big picture, very complex. You have to account for many things. Hunter actually liked to use the word, he brought it in, multivalent, which I think is a great word, meaning susceptible to many applications, interpretations, meanings, values, things that are visually complex, or inordinately complex. Multivalent, I thought that was a great word. But it's interesting that they had that background too, because artillery is not putting a bullet in a gun and pulling the trigger, pulling the cord. It's it's calculating the rotation of the earth and the wind and the weather and the drift and the trigonometry and geometry.
There's something really interesting there, is that that is it used to be about putting a bullet in a gun and pulling a trigger, and all of that understanding about how to deal with that valence is a model that has been built over time through practice and refined, and it's almost kind of making its way around Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework. It used to be ununderstandable. Like, people wouldn't know why they missed or whatever. I'm probably grossly bastardizing the history of artillery here. I do apologize. But over time, as advances in other related fields like physics and measurement and optics, over time, as those things have advanced, you've ended up with something that is much more understandable, much more accurate, which is another way of looking at orientation, right? As you become familiar with a field and you learn about it and you become embedded in it, you become more capable is not quite right, but more skilled, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You become more skilled at directing decision and action, and
or say your orientation has become more effectively matched to reality.
Yeah,
because you've broadened it, you've kept it dynamic, you've kept it growing, you've kept it updated.
Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's that continual updating, right? Because if we weren't doing that, there wouldn't be artillery. There'd still be bows and arrows.
That's right. Things change, and they're changing even now. Where I mean, we don't have to get on a defense geopolitical discussion, but where cannon artillery the way it was is not going to be anything like that anymore. They're reducing it and changing it, and a lot of the quote unquote conventional uses of it, they're come to pass, or they're already well past, and they're just finally realizing that now. But that's the thing, the nature of VUCA, right? I mean, things change, so we have to constantly update and take account for those things. If we don't, then we're going to be slaughtered, or we'll be in a military case, but maybe we'll go out of business, or we're not going to be able to compete in a market because I've read the book. I think we've talked about before, $1 Billion Lessons. I mean, the story about Kodak is crazy. I mean, it's how they saw themselves. They saw themselves as a film business. Well, why? Because they owned the word Kodak moment, and they developed film, and that was their thing. And digital photography didn't seem like a viable threat to them, so they disregarded it. And even though they invented it, I think. And then you look at the the rest of the story. None of us develop film anymore. In fact, where I live, I believe there's only one place that you can get film developed anymore, where you used to be able to do it in every grocery store, every drugstore. So, but things change, and if you're not, if your orientation isn't matched, and the models that you develop within your orientation are misaligned from reality, well, then you're going to become obsolete or irrelevant. It's just a matter of time. And the things that your competitors are taking into account and overcoming will become problems for you.
Yeah. There's a great quote from Mises that you pull out in your paper. No certainty about future conditions is available.
Nope.
And that's almost a direct. I can't remember the military strategist that used this, but no plan survives contact with the first contact with the enemy. There's a much more posh and fancy way of saying it, that the original von. Do you remember who this is? I'm sure you do.
I certainly know the phrase. I know Mike Tyson says everybody has a plan until they get hit in the face.
That as well. Yeah.
But I don't think Mike Tyson was the military strategist that came up with that quote. I'd have to look that one up. But
it's von Moltke.
Moltke, Helmut von Moltke. Yeah. Hunter did a really good job, as you see in the paper, finding a lot of Austrian thinkers basically stating Boyd theory in a different way, basically describing orientation, basically describing OODA. And I think it's not shocking to me, because when you read about the lives of Hayek and Mises, and even some of the modern Austrians, like Murray Rothbard and Israel Kirzner and others, they're all polymaths. I mean, they're all well-rounded. Like I would say Boyd is. And you look at
absolutely.
Of Boyd's work, Boyd was not limited to engineering. He was not limited to air-to-air fighter tactics. He had training in those things, but he really had an open mind that it was more like a polymath. Like I like to think of too, another one that kind of melds in here is Buckminster Fuller. And Boyd, a lot of times when I read Boyd and when I read Austrian economics, I think a lot of Buckminster Fuller, and a lot of times when I read Fuller, I think of those things too. So, and I think that these were by the way, Buckminster Fuller was also a military officer. He was a naval officer. I think that multidisciplinary, well-rounded approach really does lend to having an orientation that's more aligned with reality, or even many non-standard conditions or unforeseen events, because you're able to think non-linearly. You're able to think in a way that acknowledges the world is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So when you're surprised, you're not surprised to the point of it's going to freeze you and destroy you. You're surprised in the sense that you're going to maybe shift.
You're not surprised about being surprised, right?
You're not surprised about being surprised, no.
Yeah, and there's a certain sort of elegant recursiveness about some of these things, right? So, what we perceive. I'm just reading another passage here. What we perceive of the external world are never all of the properties which a particular object can be said to possess objectively. Not even some of the properties which these objects in fact do possess physically. So, some of my reading and some of the things that we discussed in those OODA conversations pertain to the limits of our sensory mechanisms, right? And I think that this is, it's absolutely true of individuals, where we all get messed up with our poorly biologically designed hardware. But when it comes to groups of people trying to make decisions and trying to come to, we're all, I don't know, we find ourselves in these in companies and in businesses that just seem to be endlessly searching for certainty when it just is not possible to achieve,
right?
Like by any means.
Well, I love, I think of that. So one of the sources, so you look in the references, one of the sources that we use, maybe we could put a link to, is Chuck Spinney's phenomenal PDF explaining destruction and creation, which was Boyd's only published work.
Evolutionary epistemology, you mean?
Yeah, evolutionary epistemology.
An amazing piece of writing, yeah.
There's that tremendous section, what is a pyramid, right? And there's this picture of a square, an isosceles triangle, a square with an X, and then a triangle, bisected. And I would do briefings and I would show that up on the screen, and people say it's a square, and they will argue to the death that is a square and that is a square because I know it's a square. I know what squares look like and everything. Yeah. And they never allow for the fact that they could be looking at the bottom of a pyramid, or if they're looking at an isosceles triangle, they're not thinking that I could be looking at one side of a pyramid. Now, I think what Spinney is saying, what Boyd was saying, if we don't anticipate those types of things, if we're so sure about something, we're violating what Heisenberg told us you can't do. You can't be certain, you can't fix things. And that's a very crude explanation of the uncertainty principle, but you have to allow for I think you have to have the humility that you could be wrong. Yeah. I think I'm looking at the square, but more I think about it, maybe I'm not, but I could be looking at the bottom of a pyramid. I'm going to plan for square, but I'm also going to hold over here a contingency just in case if I'm looking at the bottom of a pyramid. Most people don't think that way because they're so hell bent on what they learned in school that describes a square, and that's it, and that's the only thing. And then those theories don't work all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Because
I think there's a very interesting thing here about like being able to hold multiple points of view at once. Even when they're in tension or paradoxical. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons that people like Boyd and these other chaps that you talk about, maybe one of the reasons that we talk about them as polymaths is that in order to come to the understanding that they did, they covered an awful lot of ground, right? Philosophy, mathematics, physics. In Boyd's case, I think he was definitely getting into kind of understanding neurology and things like that as well, and understanding that okay, there's, I guess, the type 1, type 2 thinking, which I'm not sure how much water that holds anymore, but you've got that intuitive, familiar pathway that our brains inherently want to take us down because it's low energy, it's easy, and we are evolved to be energy saving machines essentially. But then there's always but what if I'm wrong, right? What if it's not that? What if there is more complicated things going on? And I think some of Gary Klein's work also speaks to this, but I think when you think about it from a business point of view, you want as much as possible to be as efficient as possible so that your bottom line is protected, and you want to deliver all of your products and services as cheaply as possible and as fast as possible. But equally, you don't want to hollow everything out so that you're inflexible and fragile and brittle when things change. And I think this is a really interesting, especially when things change so much now, like the whole Western demand for certainty and the rewarding of people that are confidently certain but wrong. I mean, that I don't see how much longer that dynamic can continue, really.
Things change, things. I think we talked about in the last discussion how I think I gave the example of where I'm sitting right now in the middle of Ohio. Where I'm sitting right now, there was once 2 miles of ice from where I sit 2 miles up. Things change. It made me also think too, what you were just describing, both where I did my undergraduate and my graduate were Jesuit schools, and the Jesuit system is one of multidisciplinary, so that, even if I went to where I went to Marquette, but even if I was a history major, so I had a very intense liberal arts curriculum. But even had I been an engineer or a business major, or even a nursing major, you still have to take literature and philosophy and theology. And the idea is that the finished product is someone that's always in total formation, someone that's always learning and world affirming, that can come from any background. So there's, I had a Jesuit history professor, a couple, and there was also Jesuit physics professors, and there's Jesuit surgeons, and there's, the Jesuit science is seismology. Some of the first discovery of plate tectonics were Jesuits. Something like half the craters on the moon are named after Jesuit astronomers. So like it was always a multi-dimensional approach, or a multidisciplinary approach. And it's funny, I've shared the paper with a few of my Jesuit mentors, and that certainly resonated, that having an orientation, having one that's multidisciplinary, and having one that's well-rounded, and having one that's constantly engaging the world for what it is, and constantly revising and updating, because things do change. We come to realize that the world is not, or the sun is not the center of the universe. It's the center of our solar system, and our solar system is one of many inside of a galaxy, which is one of many of trillions. And that evolutionary epistemology, I think, Spinney's even talking about that, how, over time, Newton came up with his theories, or Einstein came up with his theories, but he was basically, like Boyd would say, building a snowmobile. He was using other things to combine and synthesize a new approach. So you can imagine the first person that one day woke up and says, I don't think the world is flat. They would burn that person. They would tie him to a stake and, or a post, and burn them. Historically, maybe we're not always so open-minded, as we should be as humans, but that, we have to, acknowledging the nature of things, that I think that what Boyd is saying, VUCA through uncertainty, incompleteness, and entropy, that we have to have an open stance because we could be wrong. Great, Darren. Yeah, it's a great idea. Burn it.
Burn it all. Yeah, I mean, it's.
Yeah. Well, Boyd, so speaking of burn it, Boyd said that. So he said, if you think this briefing is dogma and you think it's set in stone, take it out right now and burn it.
Yeah.
I think that, I don't want to presuppose I know what he would think, but I think that what we're doing, trying to continue to evolve and create new ideas around it, and how, I think that he would be for that, because he did say, if you think this is dogmatic and static and set in stone, take it outside and burn it right now, because everything's always in a constant state of flux.
Yeah.
And if I think you saw in the paper, we have a Greek quote from Heraclitus, and Ludwig von Mises's final book, The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. I would tell anybody that's a Boyd scholar or has any interest in Boyd at all to start with that one, and The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science. And you can see, for this paper, I used it quite a bit. But the very first opening phrase is the Greek term. I forget how to pronounce it, but yeah, everything is in a ceaseless flux, says Heraclitus. So, like, at the very beginning of that book by Ludwig von Mises, he's saying that everything's in a state of flux. Yeah. Everything is constantly changing. Everything is, VUCA. So, yeah. What do we do about it? Oh.
Yeah. So, okay, here's an interesting sort of body of research, I guess, that I think is going to be very interesting to dig into in this context, and maybe we can do that in a future call. Everything is in ceaseless flux means that anything that can change will change, right? Because it's ceaseless, which means that given the span of time, eventually anything that is possible will happen, right? So you could argue that everything around us, all the emergent properties of the biosphere on Earth, is simply an outcome of that ceaseless flux, right? There's everything that can happen has happened over billions and billions of years, and now we have humans and brains and people writing papers and talking about it. And there's a really interesting branch of physics called constructor theory, which sort of examines this, and it looks at the world through, rather than the kind of mechanistic, initial starting conditions and dynamical behavior. It looks at the world slightly differently. It looks at the world in terms of factuals and counterfactuals, i.e. what is possible and what is not possible. And that very simple change means you don't really need to think about, well, I mean, you do, like, you always need to think about, if this, then that. Mm-hmm. But you actually think about it from a much bigger point of view. And I think that, when you think about that, for example, orientation shares the way we interact with the environment. It is, in a sense, the genetic code of an organism and organization.
Yeah, that's the Singer quote.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And that maps almost exactly onto books like The Dragons and the Snakes, which I've covered extensively before when I gave that talk at NATO. Mm-hmm. So, if the world is this kind of endless endless progression in ceaseless flux, then our orientation can only be the structure that builds up over time. It's almost like I don't know, this is a really probably terrible example, but every time I go into the woods with my dog, she always picks up a little branch. So we have a field that we walk through, a field of sheep, and then there's the woods. And whenever we walk back, my dog's always carrying a little branch. So if we had billions of people and billions of dogs and, billions of years, there's going to be branches scattered all over the place. Like every possible configuration of branches and field and piles and piles of really high ones and some areas with none at all. Every single area of that possible configuration is going to be explored if given enough time. So perhaps a way of thinking of our orientation is that it's the structure that is left by this process of flux. And structure is a bit of a loaded term because nobody really knows what, all the billions of neurons and trillions of connections in our brain. There is a structure there. Whether we'll ever be able to upload that into a computer and transplant people's personality, I increasingly think no, not possible.
Well, you think that energy is what animates our bodies, right? Energy can't be created or destroyed. So whatever is animating us was here before the physical sense, and that energy will be here after. Again, not to go theological, because people have theological explanations of that, which are fine. But scientifically, there's energy that animates us. There's design, because, well, how do we know that? There's very clear utility to the various things that we can do with the various systems of our body, the various systems of nature and things like that. So, and I think, back to we were talking about how people, anything that's possible, anything that happens can only happen because it was possible. I always say that Boyd discovered OODA. I don't really think that he invented it.
Absolutely.
It's a discovery, because I find OODA to be axiomatic, and I find it to be true and applicable to anywhere where humans are making decisions and acting, which is 100% of everywhere. So did Newton invent force equals mass times acceleration, or did he discover that? And I would say discovery is a part of the OODA process, because we're constantly updating our Hunter likes to, on Economics for Business, they like to use the term expand and explore, which I think is another way of saying discovery, but how we would build our orientation, or how we would even align our orientations within a company or a team. We're constantly discovering and learning. And if we're not learning, then we can't adapt, and we can't adapt, we die. It's very simple.
Yeah, well, I mean, we, in a sense, I think you can't be alive without discovering, right? Because there is no, we cannot interact with the world without the world changing us, right? As soon as we stop doing that, actually, we are dead, and we are no longer, the orientation, the structure that we have, it lasts as long as we do, right? As soon as we are no longer alive, well, there's no way to transplant my consciousness somewhere else. That pattern, that pattern that I have is gone, and it's never coming back. And it's the same with, parts of, well, we're going to get very philosophical here, but whatever happens to my body after death, all the little bits of me will continue and carry on, but whatever me is,
right,
won't. And that's why I think it's really, really interesting when you think about this in the sense of orientation, especially when it comes to organizations, because there's not that permanence, right? An organization is the people that are in it and the processes and everything else, right? So organizations evolve at a much higher rate, because every time someone new comes in, that's new genetic material. Every time someone leaves and goes to a different company, that is the spread of genetic material and
ideas
and memes and ways of doing things and ways of interacting and in the Dragons and the Snakes, Kilcullen makes exactly that point about the various kind of terrorist networks and state and non-state actors that are in constant flux as well. So it's a really interesting way of thinking of things.
They're constantly changing and adapting. They're constantly I know we both read Team of Teams by Stan McChrystal. You remember in the book, they were going around looking for themselves. They were going around looking for a hierarchical military organization. Well, he's the CO, and there must be an XO, and there must be an administration officer, and there must be an intelligence officer, and there must be an ops officer, and there must be, and it wasn't the case at all. It was a completely asymmetric enemy using Facebook, and using Twitter. And it didn't matter how good they were at what they were great at, didn't matter. They had to adapt. They had to change. I think that's a very good storytelling of how someone came to the realization of the need to adapt, the need to change in order to become more effective. And I think that's same exact principle. And I think that's why he sold a lot of those books, is that you can take that principle anywhere, that you have to recognize internally that we need to change something in order to become more effective, or else we're going to get, as Boyd would say, hosed. We're going to get our clock cleaned if we don't make the changes, and things change.
So it's a really, really interesting, well, not interesting, but quite funny video doing the rounds the other day on, I think it was Twitter or anyway, somewhere, of Russian supposed special forces going through drills and like taking down compounds and stuff. And it was like really, really Mickey Mouse. It was like, looked like LARPers with paintballs, really. And lots of military folks saying, "Oh my God, what the fuck is this? What are they doing? Blah blah blah."
Yeah.
And then there was a few lone voices saying, "Well, we all laughed at the Taliban videos as well, did we not?" And there's that, the sense that we can be absolutely superior in almost every way in conventional military skills, tactics. You would never put a company of Taliban against a company of Royal Marines or US Marines, because it just wouldn't happen. And yet, over the course of, 20 years, what ended up happening, right? We ended up leaving like all of the other forces that have been there.
Tie it back to Boyd. Remember, around his retirement, we had just finished the Vietnam War, and that was his major question: was how did we get demolished? We have all the hardware, all the capital, all the people, all the financing, all the equipment, all the technology, all the firepower, everything you could think of, and we still lost. And that was, I think, a big, if I remember studying my Boyd in his in the Coram biography, the Fighter Pilot Change the Art of War, that was his real question. How did we, with all the stuff, get demolished? And how do we lose to, networks of people in the jungle that are small villages that we couldn't, they just didn't have an answer, conventional answer to an unconventional threat. It didn't work. In fact, it made things worse. I think it, I love that book, The Best and the Brightest, or if you've ever read,
I don't think I have.
Yeah, it's about McNamara and all these statisticians that say, well, look at our body count, look at our kill count, or look at the tonnage that we've dropped, and none of it mattered. So strip out the principles. What are the lessons for that for entrepreneurs and business? Well, just throwing money at something, or just throwing capital, or just having a really effective piece of technology doesn't matter. Remember what Boyd said: people, ideas, things. If you don't have people with effective ideas, the things that you have aren't going to matter anyway.
Yep.
So I think it's more of a things approach, which is always going to lose to people with good ideas.
Speaking of things, my printer's just gone off. Excuse me.
Do you have a fax coming in?
No, I have a child printing homework. Bear with me a sec.
Let's see. Darren had a question. Conservation of energy assumes a closed system. Darren had a comment there. Conservation of energy assumes a closed system.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, actually, because one of the three kind of core pillars of Boyd is entropy, right? Entropy and the second law of thermodynamics.
Yeah.
And the distributed asynchronous organization will always be more fluid than rigid military structures. And yeah, absolutely true. And well, rigid military structures actually tend to dissolve when it's hot operations, right? I've spoken to many of my peers who served in Afghanistan, and from colonels down, and they all say, when you're in a FOB in Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else, like the things are much more flat. To your point about having comfortable sentries, right? There's no point having an uncomfortable sentry who's screaming if he's not being listened to. And hierarchies tend to be the things that attenuate the signal from the edges of an organization. So,
do you mean to say like, so the front lines, the higher headquarters has a disconnection from what's actually happening down on the front lines, and then everything's lost in between. Yeah.
And I think, part of that is scale, I guess, right? The bigger the organization. So if you've got a fluid, sort of non-aligned, really non-hierarchically aligned people that are aligned to a set of ideas and have complete freedom to maneuver within, well, I mean, they're not even bound by laws of kind of common, decency, honor, I don't know, maybe not the right words, but they've got complete freedom to move and can go in multiple different directions, take on any tactics, and then you've got this kind of rigid, rules of engagement bound system that's trying to go in with preconceived ideas of what needs to happen. I mean, we could get on and talk about Jim Grant and his paper One Tribe at a Time, arguably would have been the way to tackle a place like Afghanistan, and he was shut down.
Yeah, I think, well, and he's not unique. So I always like to think, I think Gant's model, I think I've shared it with you. But I mean, I have a whole consulting model based off of One Tribe at a Time, and sort of a fusion between that and T.E. Lawrence, which I think who's another misunderstood, ostracized figure, because we weren't thinking tanks and land wars and whatever. We were thinking of things like tribal engagement, or like I like to talk about, as a Marine, as a U.S. Marine, the combined action program in Vietnam was very effective.
Yeah.
But it didn't sell with generals and other branches, or that were all about firepower and equipment. And
well, it's not measurable, is it? It's subjective and intuitive, and
it's human. It's people.
It's about people.
People, exactly. Ideas, things.
Yeah.
Now, I think that too is as the military continues to evolve and get away from large land I mean, are we going to have another D-Day like that? I doubt it. You start to understand that, even like I don't know how it is in UK, but certainly here in the US, like the militarization of police. I mean, police have been emphasizing more on the equipment, the tools, the firepower, and not so much the community orientation of policing. The human element of policing, getting the human intelligence. It's almost like completely over reliant on technology and firepower, and I think that's the same kind of syndrome. That's the best and the brightest. If you've ever read about Daniel Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg was a U.S. Marine. He's very controversial in some circles because he was the Pentagon Papers. He's the one who, I guess, he would be of the day. Maybe a comparison would be like the Snowden of those days that released all this information at great personal risk, because he could have been put away for treason for life, maybe even gotten the death sentence. I don't know, but it ended up bringing down Richard Nixon, or one of the things that actually go in and read his story called Secret. So he was an infantry officer in the Marines, and he was really one of the architects of the Vietnam War, because he was a statistician from Harvard. There's he was an economist, and there's a thing called the Ellsberg paradox on decision making, in fact. So it's really interesting to look at that. And he's coming from the perspective of a U.S. Marine. But when he was in Vietnam on the ground and operating on the ground, he realized there was a complete disconnect between what the mindset was, or what they were thinking at the top, and then what he was seeing down in the front end of things. There was a massive disconnect. So I mean, I think a lot of that gets shrouded in the controversy of divulging information, whatever. But I think that the point, again, we strip out the politics and the military aspects of it. You look at the principles, a person down there dealing with what's going on, that feedback, that input has to come back. I mean, it has to be part of the decision. It has to be part of, I guess, the culture of a team or an organization where information flows freely so that people have a clear understanding of what's actually going on and they're not disconnected from reality. If you remember in team,
but then there's always a limit, right? There's always a limit to that.
There's a limit. Yeah.
Maybe there's a direct parallel here between companies. So one of my favorite books is Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Conduct.
Oh yeah.
About the SOE.
Yeah.
And even though that was arguably the initiative that led to us winning the Second World War in many ways, it was almost completely non-military the way it went about it, right? They didn't have objectives and top-down plans. They started building capabilities. They hired a bunch of lunatics, one of which was a caravan builder, and a bunch of weirdos, and they just had them building shit, right? Just go and build this, try this, do this. And they had, and their first few operations were farcical and an absolute joke, but they learned really quickly because everything was driven from what they found on the ground.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the problem that we have in, the military campaigns of the last several decades, and some of the issues that companies seem to have now, is that there is a limit to, as Darren says in the comments, like lines of comms get more opaque the higher it goes, right? Because there are certain mismatches between what's happening in different parts of the organization, and they are paradoxical because they are happening at different times or with different people, and people's perceptions are different. By the time that all rolls up and tries to get aggregated together, you end up with a big ball of mud, and nobody can really see the wood from the trees. Whereas if you have autonomy and people just operating and doing what they need to do, yes, you have less alignment, but you have this kind of emergent direction, rather than the Western archetype of the heroic leader who is directing action, like the spider in the middle of the web. You get this kind of emergent ecosystem type of thing, and I think that must be the way that things progress as things go faster and faster.
I think the model that we had in the Marine Corps, which certainly should be mimicked in business, was the strategic corporal. And this was an initiative by General Charles Krulak, who ironically, his father was Lieutenant General Victor Krulak, who Robert Coram also wrote a tremendous biography on called Brute. And his father really was this amazing Marine innovator. I can't recommend that book enough, but the Marine Corps has always been reinventing itself, always been smashing the models. And we mentioned Buckminster Fuller and Boyd in the same sentence. Well, Buckminster Fuller's design for geodesic domes was actually tested by the Marine Corps, in the 50s. And Krulak's father, General Krulak, Lieutenant General Brute Krulak, he's the guy that saw the helicopter as a weapon. He invented heliborne assault, and he identified the need for the Higgins boats that landed at D-Day and things like that. It's a lot of contributions, but I think it comes from that mind. And by the way, guerrilla warfare. So he was, I think, President Kennedy's advisor on guerrilla warfare situations in Vietnam before before Johnson became president, whatever. But the strategic corporal concept was interesting because at the lowest level, I think that's mission. What we're talking about now is intent or mission command. When everybody on the team understood what had to happen, the decisions could be made at the lowest level fast.
Yeah. Well, there's your implicit guidance and control from Boyd as well, right? That's what it's, the orientation, another word for alignment, that allows you to have that quick, intuitive, Fingerspitzengefühl type decision making that allows you to react at the speed you need to. And the challenge that I think most of our human structures and society has at the moment is that just does not scale. It doesn't scale well
Well,
enough.
it's easy to point out why, because if we're talking, you mentioned Fingerspitzengefühl, fuel, but you think of Einheit, mutual trust.
Yep.
Trust, where there is no mutual trust, forget about it.
Yep.
You know, the reason why I tell people this all the time, you know, when I had Command of Marines, I never told a Marine how to do something. I just told them what to do and when it needed to be done by, and that was it. They'd find a way. And, you know, you tell them, hey, I don't want any, you know, the only questions I usually ask, did you have to kill anybody or break any laws? And as long as the answer was no, I didn't care what they did or how they did it, because it had to get done. And they knew that. So, you know, I think that's the strategic corporal was essentially that at the lowest level of troop leadership in the field, you know, a corporal commanding a fire team or a squad, that he has a clear understanding of the political situation, of the strategic situation, that he can make the decisions right there, so they don't have to go back through channels to buffers to buffers to buffers. By the time you finally get back to grandpa, it's too late anyway. You know, you've already missed an opportunity. Well, it's the same thing in business, right? So if people are not empowered to, Joe McChrystal in that book calls it empowered execution. If they don't have the empowered execution to make the decisions on the spot in alignment with mission, in alignment with strategy, then and there, you're going to lose your time advantage.
Yep.
And that's the concept of the strategic corporal. But I think it has to be, I would think that in entrepreneurship situations or business situations, you still have to have that mutual trust where everyone is aligned to the mission, so that the decisions can be made at the lowest possible level in order to promote operating with speed and quickness.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, we've been going for an hour. I could definitely carry on for some more, but maybe we should leave a bit in the tank and come back and maybe tackle. Well, we could definitely dig into some more mission command and think about, you know, mission command in the context of well, actually, maybe we could look at mission command in the context of where we started, Austrian economics, and maybe we could do that one next time.
Yeah, you saw how we closed with that, you know, intent. You know, talking about
intent. Yeah, nice.
If you link to the page from the Mises Institute, if you just type Mark McGrath and OODA, the link comes up for not only the podcast but a lot of the content that's already out there.
So I think what I'll do is I'll go through on all the social channels this is on, and I'll put.
Darren Wood threw one more thing in there. He said, "Why servant governance structures work best for being an adaptive enterprise."
Yeah,
I would extrapolate. Yeah, people first.
Yeah,
it always, like we talked about in the podcast with Hunter. You know, people, ideas, things. If people are empowered to make decisions at their level, that's, like McChrystal would say, you know, that's the empowered execution. But people with the right ideas can accomplish missions that, you know, they have the right things, but the people and the ideas take precedence. You know?
Yeah, 100%. Cool. Right, let's wrap that one up. I'll hit the stop button and we'll have a I'll go through and send some notes, and then we'll have a think about what to follow up with. So anyone who's still watching, drop some questions, and we'll come back next time.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
All right. Cheers,
Thanks,
Ben.
everyone. Cheers.